say we're delighted to have Kevin with AFSC. He joined us just in October, and he's the education coordinator with our Governing Under the Influence campaign. He comes to us as a young guy, but with some really solid experience as an intern with Public Citizen in Washington, UFCW in Washington, and Senator Tom Harkin's DC office. So we're very privileged to have him a part of our work, and I look forward to seeing this program. Go, Kevin.
Hi everybody, my name is Kevin Rutledge, and I'm going to hook my computer up here and talk at the same time. Okay. Perfect. Yeah, so first off, I really want to thank everybody for coming out, and especially Holly and Dawn and all the organizations that helped co-sponsor this, and everybody else who's presenting today too, because this is such an important issue, and it affects everybody. It relates to everybody, as far as governing under the influence, from too much corporate money and power in whatever industry that is, whether it's the healthcare industry, whether that is the school and education, or climate change, or what else do we have here? Yeah, I mean anything. It just all around affects everybody, and that's what we're here to talk about today. We're talking a lot about the problem, but we're hopefully getting to the solution too. Yeah, that works fine. You want to get the lights?
Don't target it. You got, okay. Yeah.
Cool. So this is our logo here, and these are our banners on each side, and we've got a banner also outside as well. And our logo is a little White House with the dollar sign flying above it, because there's a lot of money in our political system, and we're focused on the presidential campaign. In 2016. This is our hashtag, it's Who Profits, if you're on Twitter, and this is our website, gui.afsc.org. You should check us out. So today, I'm here to talk about the weapons industry, like who's profiting from this and who's paying it, with the who's paying it part being nice. So we focus on some other issues, but this is a very big one, as AFSC, American Friends Service Committee, is a Quaker nonprofit and a pacifist organization. They've been a leader in peace and social justice all over the world for like 100 years, almost 100. So this is, some of you may recognize him or remember this speech. It's Dwight D. Eisenhower when he left office in 1961, and this was part of his farewell speech. And he talks about the unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex, and just the vast growing and expansion within the military and corporations together. And he goes on to say the potential for disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. And, that was I think my dad was born that year, but that was a long time ago for me at least. But that's about 50 years, and that's still prevalent today, and that's just still happening today. Does anybody remember this speech? Yeah. Okay. So and this is one of the reasons why we're talking about this, because our military influence is all over the world. Do you guys know how many different military bases that we have around the world?
Probably 1,000 plus or minus.
1,000 plus or minus, that's a good guess. It's around 700. I've seen different numbers, but I really like this map. I like it that it displays all of this, but then I don't like it that, wow, we still have like over 100 military bases in Japan and almost 200 in Germany, and we're still everywhere. and you know, we're occupying you know, space, and you know, to promote freedom or whatever. And so all that stuff, that costs a lot of money, doesn't it? So our next slide, here we have a graph, and it's about the Pentagon slush fund. So the dark blue there, that represents the money that's being spent. So the bottom line is each year, each fiscal year, it goes up to 2012, and the left side of it, that's the amount of money that's being spent. So the little green line right there, which you may or may not be able to see, that's the amount of active military troops that we have. And so as you can see, like there's a little rivet on the right side. That's 2011 with the terrorist, or 9/11 2001 with the terrorist attacks, and how it just kind of steadily jumps up from there. And I mean, you can see different areas of where we've increased or decreased. But then there's that little shaded area, and that's called the Overseas Contingency Operations. And so it's like a slush fund in the terms of they can throw a lot of money, Congress and people lobbying for that. These emergency funds for Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and they pack it full, so we end up spending a lot more money. But who's profiting from that? How is this all happening? Why is all this happening? Anybody have an explanation there?
Profitable for somebody.
It's extremely profitable, right?
0.001% that owns the military contractors.
And that helps provide the money to buy elections.
It sure does, and that's part of what we're here to talk about today.
Yeah. Can I have some?
And so today, we've got this war on terror that where there's over 700 military bases, but we also have a lot more war occurring, and that's one of the reasons that we're doing this program. We're talking about militarism, not just overseas and in other countries, but in our communities too, and how that's affected, that military-industrial complex, how that affects us here in our own communities. And so we've got the war on terror, okay, so who's profiting from that? These massive Pentagon contractors that we'll talk more about. And we've got the war on crime and the war on drugs. Who profits from that? There's a private prison industry who actively lobbies and spends millions and millions of dollars to keep people locked up. And they profit. It's a very profitable industry. We also have the war at the border, and these are all some of our focuses with our Governing Under the Influence project. Militarizing the border and also detention centers.
How about war in the urban cities?
Yeah. You're right. And I meant to mention that with the war on crime and the war on drugs, militarization of our police forces, and that's something that I talked to Rand Paul about that. And there's in Iowa it's a big problem too. And there's funds from the Department of Homeland Security where they've we receive military grade weapons. In our I know there's been MRAPs, like mine resistant. I can't remember something, vehicles, they're like tanks. And then there's the Bearcats, those are like a 13-passenger, bulletproof, military grade like vehicle, which I think you guys have one here. I think there's, okay, yeah.
Yes.
Right, because there's a lot of mines in Iowa you gotta watch out for when you're driving around, right? Yeah, I've got a slide on that later, but so I asked him about that, and Rand Paul told me that he was in support of stopping the funding for all of that, because they're sending like 12,000 bayonets to police forces, and he's asking questions, and nobody really gives him an answer. He's like, what are they preparing for? They're preparing, for war, for battle. I mean, and it's awful, and I mean, it's great to be able to engage with candidates and engage with them and have conversations about it. So we're getting the candidates talking about the issues. So one of my purposes here today, why? Why does this all happen? To expose the problem. We can always ask why. And so we're talking Pentagon contractors who are using their political influence to profit more from war. So how we're doing that is we're exposing the campaign donations and the lobbying that these massive Pentagon contractors are spending to get more money. You know, it's like that pay-to-play format. You pay money to these candidates, you pay money to lobby them, and then you get something back in return. And more importantly, like, what can we do about it? So this is a solution that AFSC is doing in Iowa and in New Hampshire. So there's a whole variety of tools, and that's kind of why we're here today. A lot of different people and groups collaborating and working together, and putting our tools, you know, together. And the big one that's in our toolbox is asking candidates questions and challenging corporate power. So that's what my little thing was earlier up here, because we have the Iowa caucuses here. All the candidates are around. I know Bernie Sanders and Rand Paul, they're both here. Wait, no, Rand Paul isn't in Iowa City, but they're both in Iowa next weekend. So we've been following a lot of them. You can check more of them out on our website. But so a little bit more about military-industrial complex. More weapons, more profits. It's a pretty simple equation, you know. And so how do they get more money? They use that money to lobby and give money to candidates so they can get more weapons. So it's just an everlasting circle. It's like, where does it stop? Where does it end? Chicken or the egg, you know? So the one on the left here, that's a boneyard. It's in Arizona. There's like 3,000 or 4,000 unused aircraft that are just sitting there. They're just sitting there collecting dust and wasting, you know, space, as more contractors are building these more high-tech, expensive, super expensive weapons like the F-35, which, you know, we'll talk a little bit about that too. So there's a lot that's just sitting and just wasting because they want to build more and make more money. So this is a kind of cool little graph here. So, you know, it describes how they use that. So we'll start up with Congress. All right, so they pass the bills, they pass, you know, laws, funding for anything and everything. And so they take that tax funding, and so they make things for the Department of Defense, which is, you know, the biggest spending, you know, that our government spends on. And so, you know, the Department of Defense, they give these tax dollars contracts to these massive military corporations. And so the military corporations, and they'll give more money to Congress, so then the Congress can pass more laws for them, or more bills, or more contracts, more tanks, more F-35s, more anything and everything. And then that gets passed, and it's just where does it stop?
It's called recycling.
It is. They are recycling the money. You're right. You know, that's what they're doing.
Yeah, but they're paying less and less in taxes. We're paying more and more of these costs.
Right. In you know, paper money, we're paying that, but then we're also paying. Other people are paying with their lives, with drones, and there's you know, how much rate. You know, General Dynamics makes $10 to $12 million per drone that they make. Here are some of the top players: Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon, United Technologies, General Dynamics. This is actually just comes right from our banner here. So a couple years ago, they spent $14 million on candidates. They also spent $53 million lobbying, and they got $142 billion in contracts. That's just 1 year. That's not including like all the profits they made from it either. That's just the size of the contracts. So it's something obviously wrong, you know. Where's our influence coming from? So this is a picture last week from we were outside the Lincoln dinner, where there was 11 presidential candidates at. And you know, to go along with the money in politics and everything. So these are volunteers, they're with another organization. You know, we use street theater, that's a tool to expose corporate, you know, control. And so we don't know who's paying for our candidates, who's paying for their elections, who's funding their campaigns, all that. So we've got like Lockheed Martin up there, we've got Boeing, we've got ExxonMobil, and they're drinking martinis, and there's like money in the martinis and money attached to them. There's a cow, the Pentagon sacred cow. People were really confused by it, but it was pretty funny. Yeah, we have these big demonstrations, and here's another picture. We had the military budget, or the whole budget, just stretched out, and people were passing it and walking by it as they were walking inside. And so this is another way that we're exposing and not just protesting whoever's talking inside, but just raising the issues and the awareness about that. Does someone have a question?
Do we ever learn the names of the legislatures who are being lobbied? Do we have to know the names?
That stuff is available. There's opensecrets.org where they expose a lot of the money in politics about who's giving money to who's the big donors, the super PACs, the candidates, the organizations. There's some other websites too, but it should be more easily available so you can tell who is actually funding who you're voting for. So this is the F-35. What's that?
Luke Skywalker.
Luke Skywalker, yeah, he's
What?
this. It looks like his plane, doesn't it? Like it's from the future, but this is now. So this is they've been making this plane, trying to make it for 20 years. They've already spent $400 billion on it. It's the most expensive thing that the U.S. military has ever spent money on. Because they've already put that big of an investment in there, they're like, okay, well, we're just going to keep going with it. It doesn't fly or shoot or it's unsafe, so we'll keep spending $1.5 trillion more dollars, and hopefully we'll get it right. So that raises a lot of questions, like, wow, that's taken a long time and a lot of money. Why is this happening? So these are some other big contractors who are who are profiting, but also contribute to this complicated and expensive weapons system that they try and jack it and load it up to make it do everything possible, because this is America, and they want one thing to do everything. So there's a lot. Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Goodrich, which is United Technologies now. Rockwell Collins is on here. There's just a lot of players that are involved, so it's a pretty complicated thing. So that's what one thing we're here to talk about is the solution, and just identifying the problem, but also talking about the solution. And so, as you guys have been aware, we asked presidential candidates questions. Here's Kathleen in the back, pleading to Bernie Sanders, like, look, the F-35, they're making a lot of money. This is my first week on the job, and we asked them the question in New Hampshire, so it's very hands-on. And because in Vermont, they have the F-35 bases or manufacturing there, and so we asked him about that, and he said, well, look, our state needs jobs. It's going to go somewhere. It's either like here or Florida or South Carolina. So I'm going to need jobs for my state. And that's kind of what you're being your position is. You're being hired for to create jobs or help your people out. So anyways, that's $37 billion in government contracts. Well, 2013, and they made $47 billion from it in revenue.
Well, what is Sanders' record on voting?
Well, and we've asked some more questions. That was just specifically about the F-35 and about the manufacturing in the state, but we've also asked some more a few times in Iowa and in New Hampshire about the Pentagon contractors and lobbying and influencing legislation, public policy, and he called them out and saying there's a lot of fraud that's going on. If you go in there and ask, where's the money going, like they can't track all of it. Almost all of the top Pentagon contractors have fraud, and there's something wrong, and nothing's being done about it. So that's kind of cool to hear more about that.
I wanted to make a comment about the Bernie Sanders thing and about his comment about fraud. I think that's almost a red herring. The real issue is the amount of money we're putting into it. And there is corruption and there is fraud. I don't know if but we shouldn't be distracted by the idea of fraud, because the system itself is so messed up. That's what we need to be looking at, is how much money is going into the weapons industry and why. I mean, as Bernie Sanders, I mean, a lot of us are going to like Bernie Sanders. But even he wants to say, well, it's all about jobs, and I'm in this state and I got to protect it. Well, you know what? What about let's turn the jobs around into something like education, into infrastructure? They're so afraid to do that, that we've got to push them on it. And I just want to say one other thing. So when he was in Iowa, I had a chance to talk to him. No, he's not. Well, yeah, anyways, when he was here in Iowa, and I asked him about a couple things related to peace, and his response was, oh, why? Why here in the middle of the country do we have a peace state? Now, I know that we deserve that sort of credit, but I hope we would feel challenged by it. Every time he appears, we should be pushing him on this. He's good on so much, and yet, you know, the peace issue's not so much. So I just want to say that, because I think that's a great place with the bird dog, and push him on this. You know, we want an end to this violence. We want our money to go somewhere else.
Go into the plowshares.
Yes, thank you, good point.
Just a short comment. I would suggest not calling it defense budgets. Because we haven't fought a war of defense for 65 years. So to call it military spending is good, but it sort of confuses the situation and sells it to the public to call it defense budget.
Well, these aren't actually my words or my graph. It's from courts, QZ.com. I understand what you're saying, but this is just like, it's just good figures. Yeah, that's good to point that out for.
Good point.
Well, what I can't understand is if Bernie Sanders is saying, okay, you provide these jobs for his constituents, however, that plane that you just showed is not being used for anything. It's not useful. So you got jobs, but you're never going to use the item because it's...
And that's what he asked the person that was asking the question, like, what am I supposed to, or what would you do? And he kind of flipped the question back on him. I mean, yeah, I mean, it's obvious there's a lot of waste, there's a lot of wasteful spending, but it's also creates a lot of jobs, and it says that they're
infrastructure will create jobs.
Well, and he's in favor of infrastructure.
yeah, and so they're like, it doesn't.
There's a whole system. There's a system.
With that specifically, like they're trying to make it like hover and like go in all these sorts of crazy directions, and it says it doesn't shoot like until like in 2 years from now is when it'll like actually shoot and fire and function, as a whole aircraft. But yeah, go ahead.
I know what the function of that weapon is. It's to bleed off excess funds from America because we obviously have too much money.
Yeah, you gotta soak it up somehow. So, all right, I'm gonna keep going here. So yeah, could you get the light, please? So
I have a question. If you ask Senator Sanders, what would that company in Vermont spend on this if the government didn't support it? As a matter of business, would they develop something and pay for the development process and then come to the government and say, here we have this, and it works?
well, I wish I could answer that question for you. But this, like as you saw, it's been going on for like 20 years. It's deeply ingrained into the military-industrial complex. There's a lot of other candidates that are kind of involved who sit on these committees, and a lot of like these, revolving door from people who work in the military, industry, or people who work, as a military official, and then who then work in the these top Pentagon contractors. So I mean, it's a deeply ingrained thing, and it's not just like an easy thing to fix because there's a lot of people in power who don't want to fix it exactly like that.
But it is a great question to ask Bernie.
Right, it is.
Who's going to be here next week?
So, all right, so we're going to move on here. I'm going to throw some more numbers at you. I'm going to give you a handout, or maybe Kathleen already gave it to you. But anyways, this just shows, some other the same top players, how much money is being spent, how much they've made from it. There's, you know, hundreds of millions of dollars in some of these, you know, from lobbying, just from, you know, not even 20 years ago. So there's some of that.
The right-hand column, excuse me,
Mhm.
the percentage that came from the Pentagon, these people are not willing to investigate and build this and develop it themselves without practically being blocked by the government.
So they're very heavily,
Boeing is the lowest at 38%.
because they also do a lot of other, like, commercial stuff too. So some of their stuff comes from, you know, like contracts from our government, other comes from the commercial. But yeah, so I mean, they're very heavily reliant upon our government, upon them too, and they're a business, you know. So as a business model, more you want to grow, and so you want to make your shareholders happy, you want to make more money. And so in order to do that, you have to make more weapons. And so we're just filled with a world of weapons that we're giving weapons to, you know, all these other countries, and then we're fighting against them. In Syria and everything that's going on in the Middle East. And it's a very complicated, deeply ingrained, you know, system, and something needs to be done about it. And that's why we're doing all this here in Iowa. I'm actually from Iowa too, I'm from Ottumwa. But yeah, and I mean, it's cool to be able to talk to people in power who actually have a, you know, chance to do something about it. So, yeah, there's
I see another column of what is the net income for the company, or not.
So, I don't have that in this column, because
I realize that.
in this whole thing, there's so many numbers, like, my head
This
turns
is
around.
designed to support the system.
Yeah, it's designed to support them, you know, getting more money.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly it. So I'll show you some other examples. Here's one thing with the M1 Abrams tank. You know, we'll start at the top. General Dynamics, they make these tanks, and so they're making weapons, or they're making aircraft or tanks that the Army doesn't want, or that the Navy doesn't want, or the Air Force doesn't want, or doesn't ask for. But they're using their money to manipulate the system, and so this, you know, General Dynamics, they gave $25,000 to this representative here in Ohio, which they make these tanks in Ohio. That's where the base is at, where the manufacturing place is at. And so then he, Turner, fills in a bill, you know, saying you know, we need more tanks from General Dynamics, but they didn't ask for it, you know, for the Army, and so we end up paying that difference. So that was like 120 million, which isn't, I mean, it is a lot, but compared to all of the other billions and billions, that's hard to even imagine and comprehend. This is just one example of governing under the influence, you know, because we're not involved in that process at all.
Kevin, there's a number, and I believe the number is over 3,000 of these Abrams tanks
Yep.
that we have mothballed in the desert, just like those planes. And even
Yep,
with those
I think they're in the
mothballs,
same place, yep.
General Dynamics got it through Congress to continue building Abrams tanks through the through the fiscal year 14 and fiscal year 15. It looks like fiscal year 16 program. We're going to continue to build tanks, simply ship them out there mothballed. And they were all designed for a land war in Europe, which I guess unless we're going to Ukraine, we're never going to use. We're trying to get to Ukraine. Bob's trying to get to Ukraine. Maybe we're just stockpiling so that when we have all-out war in Ukraine, you know, we can park tanks at the border as a barrier to the Russians.
And like the more that I've been working on this and researching this, I mean, I remember playing the game Risk with my dad, like when I was really young. Like this is real life. Like, and there's so much money that's involved, and that's exactly what's happening. They're preparing for destruction, but we already have more weapons than any and everybody else, and it's insane. So here's another example of something that's happening more currently. There's these stealth bombers. I can't remember exactly how much it cost for one of them. But anyways, the contract is for $55 billion. So then you have these top three players trying to get that contract. And so they do what they do best and spend money to get that, you know, to win that contract.
Which we normally refer to as bribery.
Which is what it is, yeah. And so just from, and I got all this information from, it was a maplight.org. I saw it email list I'm on, and anyways, I connected with them and like connected with Twitter and so it's so easy to connect with all these national people. People are really interested that we have access to these presidential candidates and we can talk about real issues. Anyway, so they've given over $200 million since 2010, through campaign contributions and lobbying. Just this first quarter in 2015, that's only 3 months, they've spent $10 million lobbying specifically on, that's included with this stealth bomber contract. And so just this past year, on average, they've spent 2.1 times more on the people who are creating the legislation that directly benefits them, the House Defense Appropriations Subcommittee. So they spent 2.1 times more on them than any other people in Congress. So it's, if you got the money to do that, like we don't have the money to do that. I mean, I can't speak for anybody else.
Well,
But,
that should be 27 million, not 27.
No, it's
per representative, it's like
Right.
35 members on the committee.
Right, so that's on average, and that's only with these 3. That's not including anybody else. And right, there are obviously limits on how much they can technically spend on it.
These 3 are still vying for the contract?
Yes, I believe so. This is an ongoing thing, and there's a big article in Politico about it. And so also,
This is the B2? Is this the
yes,
B2?
I believe so, yes. So there's another conflict of interest when 29 members of Congress already are invested in these 3 companies. Worth between $870,000 and $2.5 million. So what are we doing about it? Well, we're asking questions about it. So this was kind of what I had already explained earlier about Rand Paul in the police forces. This was the first person that I asked a question to, like personally, so that was kind of cool. And then I included just a few others. This was like last week. Lindsey Graham, he did a street walk, and you can see the same GUI banners there, and ask him the questions about military-industrial complex, Pentagon spending. Same thing with Chris Christie. This was also in New Hampshire.
He is working.
So, I'm not here to talk about that, but we did our staff in New Hampshire gave him a report on for-profit prisons and governing under the influence, and he seemed a little reasonable on immigration. So that was kind of cool.
New Jersey.
But this was in New Hampshire.
Forget about it.
Anyways, yeah, and then we had a student at University of Iowa help ask Senator Sanders a question about the influence of lobbying from these same corporations that we're talking about, and he answered about the fraud and everything. So yeah, I mean we're doing a lot, and we're asking questions and we're taking action, and so this was just one example of a question. And I know that's a mouthful. That's why we prepare and plan them out. So corporations like Lockheed Martin recycle, right, because they're green, recycle taxpayer dollars to lobby for nuclear weapons contracts. In 2014, they spent over $14.5 million. As president, what steps would you take to make sure our national security policies are driven by what's best for the American people and not for Lockheed Martin's profit margins?
And that's an excellent question. It
So-
should be presented on those 3 guys that are going after that other thing.
Yeah, so there's
If they can't fund their own research, then why should we?
and there's also this other group, I can't remember the name, it's like APPS. It's Americans for Peace and Prosperity and Security. Anyways, their whole advisory board is filled with like past directors or current, directors or high representatives of Lockheed Martin, of all these other military, Pentagon contractors who are, they hosted an event in New Hampshire with Carly Fiorina talking about, what needs to happen in public policy and in terrorism and security, and same thing in Des Moines with Rick Perry. So that's governing under the influence. They're the advisory board and they're making decisions and spending. Well, I can't say spending millions because I don't know that much about them, but they're using that influence to say, you know, what people should do, what they should vote for, but we're asking questions to everybody, regardless of, you know, if they're Democrat or Republican or whatever. Here's just a few resources. Talked about a few of them: Open Secrets, MapLight. There's a bunch of contracts for any, you know, government contractor from usspending.gov, and that's me in action right here. Go back, sorry. I just like seeing me, that's why. I don't know. Yeah, so I guess we've got a couple minutes here. I don't know if
A couple of little tidbits.
I had a comment.
Sure.
So we can either pay, you know, it's like, which would you rather pay? $25,000 to support a representative like Turner to get him into Congress? So this is just a.
It's for the recorders.
So we can either pay for our own elections on the front end where we have representatives who represent us. That would be like $25,000 to Representative Turner in Ohio. Or we can pay 4,800 times more on the tail end when we're on the hook for the bill for $120 million for the tanks that we don't want. So that's one thing for, you know, public funding of our elections would get us actually representation instead of just the bill.
Couple of little tidbits. The stealth bomber, $1997, $929 million each a piece per $1997. I also looked up the number of countries in the world. Maybe you want to sit down for this, Kevin. There are only 196. You said there were 732 military bases.
Right, so that's the amount of countries that there are in the
That's
world.
basically right, and there's
I'm
only
talking-
196 countries in the world. We
Right.
have more military bases in more countries
Yeah.
than we have countries to put them in. I mean, it's just dummy, and that's our money, okay? That's because these companies are not paying taxes, but we don't have enough money to feed our kids and educate them. I'm done.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I am so done.
You have a question?
Yeah, I'm gonna ask you a question, is that okay?
Okay.
When you're done.
Am I gonna get bird dog?
Am I gonna get bird dog?
I think so. No, really. But before, I do have a question I'd like to ask you because you're gonna be a candidate.
I am a cat.
You are a candidate. And my question is really, how would you respond to this when you see this kind of money being spent on the Pentagon and they're gonna come at you?
Rockwell Collins is in Cedar Rapids.
Right.
One of the things that with the F-35, you guys all know this, they have spread the subcontracts out to 48 of the 50 states.
Yeah.
Every congressional district, every senator has a contractor like Rockwell Collins that's got a piece of that pie. I think the first place you're going to say to Rockwell Collins, one, is this plane needed? And if it's not needed, I'm sorry. I understand you've got 6,000 people working for you in Cedar Rapids. I understand that there's 500 of them working on the F-35 sub. I'm sorry, you're going to have to find another line of work for that 500 people. That's going to be a tough conversation, Kathleen, but I think the way that you beat this as a representative is you say, unlike Bernie Sanders, understand that I'm creating 500 jobs here. You have to ask the bigger question, do we need this plane? If we don't need this plane, then I'm sorry, we're going to have to find another contractor, another thing for these 500 workers to do.
That'd be great. I'd love to see you do it, and I'd love to see a lot more do it. But thank you. I really did wonder how will you handle this kind of pressure. And it is break time, but Kevin has a really good story that he hasn't shared about his work with scattergood students and doing a little training. The other thing about us asking questions, it's really about changing the dialogue. It's about getting it in the media, it's about getting the candidates talking about it, and he has one important success story, and then we'll go to break.
So she said an important story. I'm like, oh gosh, what do I do now? Which story? I think so. Anyway, so yeah, at Scattergood Friends School, which is just 10-15 minutes outside of town in West Branch, Quaker Friends School. I was out in October and had a few of them along after I did a presentation there. And one of them asked Hillary Clinton about the immigrant detention bed mandate, or the bed quota of 34,000 immigrants detained every day. Majority of those in private prisons, and so she was like flabbergasted by it. She didn't expect the question from a 16-year-old girl, high school student. And she was like, well, let me look at that. She looked at it, she's like, wow, that's a long question. Handed it to her aide, and they talked about Quakers, and because her daughters went to a Quaker school at Sidwell in DC. And anyway, so then she responded, nobody has ever asked me that question before, I'll look into it. And then, a few weeks ago, it was all over the news. Hillary was talking to some dreamers in Nevada, and she was sharing her stances on immigration, and she talks exactly about what we talk about, the for-profit prisons, the detention bed mandate, how people are profiting from this, and this isn't right. Whereas, 6 months or so ago, she didn't. Nobody asked me that. So that's like one of the ways that we're influencing or changing, the dialogue. And how that really, all it takes is like one question. And when we have a few people asking one question at a time all over the state, and, they listen, they change their stances, they become educated. A lot of these candidates, they don't know everything. They're not experts on everything, so we're educating them.